welcome back if you've been watching and from the beginning of the show, and welcome to the show if you're just tuning in now. So let's go back to the carbon-14 dating. We're talking, of course, about the Shroud of Turin, and if you're watching part 2, you've watched part 1, so I don't have to go back. So anyway, we're getting to the carbon-14 dating, which is really, really cool. I mean, debunking the debunking, because this doesn't take a stretch of imagination whatsoever to see that the carbon-14 dating had exactly the result that one would expect to have if the shroud was the burial cloth of Jesus, and if everything about the shroud is true, then the carbon-14 dating, came out exactly where it should have come out. So let me back up a couple of seconds with Barrie and start with him.
Oh, and the quiver of people who say that for the exit wound to be through the wrist because it makes it more secure.
Was driven through, would not have broken any of the bones of the hand. It would have gone through without doing so. But those bones would have served to fasten that hand very tightly to the cross so that the man couldn't tear his hand loose.
Okay, the number one, arrow in the quiver of people who say that the shroud is a forgery is, of course, the carbon-14 dating. So we can't be complete without addressing that.
Sure. And carbon-14 dating is a generally reliable scientific test for approximating the age of an organic object. And, of course, linen cloth is organic. So carbon-14 is an appropriate test for that kind of material. In 1988, 3 radiocarbon dating laboratories were given the permission to do and perform a radiocarbon dating test on the shroud itself. Unfortunately, when it got down to it, they stood over the cloth for about an hour and a half arguing as to where they should take the sample from.
Okay, Barrie is going to do a phenomenal job of explaining exactly what happened with the carbon-14 dating and why the result was what it is. So I'm going to let him do that. Obviously, this is part of my fun of making fun of these superstitious materialists, right? Let me just bring up my good friend Chesterton here. And remember, this is just another quote of his. When I'm asked as a purely intellectual question why I believe in the Catholic faith, I can only answer, I believe in it quite rationally upon the evidence. We, in fact, are the ones with all the evidence, and dismissing the evidence does not, I don't want to say does not work, cannot be done honestly, basically. The believers in miracles accept them, rightly or wrongly, because they have evidence for them. The disbelievers in miracles deny them, rightly or wrongly, because they have a doctrine against them. That's all. So, of course, the New York Times was absolutely delighted to have an excuse to deny the miracle of the Shroud of Turin. And so I'm just making fun of them a little bit. This is a headline. I wasn't about to pay the New York Times, so I couldn't get it quite right without paying. But here's an article, if you can make it out. The Shroud of Turin called not authentic. Okay, and you have a bunch of microphones before that person. Obviously, this is the truth. It's been proven to be not authentic according to the New York Times. Another one. How carbon-14 was used to fix the date of the shroud. So now we know that its origin was 13th or 14th century because the linen was dated to the 13th or 14th century. And this is a long scientific explanation. You see there's a little scientific picture there that shows how scientific everything was. So anyway, of course, you have to believe in science. Therefore, we know it's a forgery. And here is, this is actually in the op-ed page of the New York Times for 600 years. I don't remember. Can't tell if that's a 600 or 400 years. Shroud of Turin has been known as a forgery. Okay, so it's always been known to be a forgery. This carbon-14 business just proved it. And here's actually my favorite. It's from Nature magazine. Anyway, Nature magazine it's a very high-profile, prestigious science magazine, but it's way up there with the New York Times and CNN as an authoritative source. This is an article from, what's that say on top? 1989, Nature magazine. Very small samples. By the way, look, the long list of authors, right? What's that? That's about 16 scientists there. So this must be right. If 5 million Frenchmen can't be wrong, used to be an ad. 16 scientists can't be wrong. The subtitle of the article says, very small samples from the Shroud of Turin have been dated by accelerator mass spectrometry in laboratories at Arizona, Oxford, and Zurich. 3 laboratories spread around the world. Okay, so this is definitely, confirmed. As controls, 3 samples whose ages had been determined independently were also dated. You'll hear Barrie talk about that, about the ages determined independently. The results provide conclusive evidence that the linen of the Shroud of Turin is medieval. That's actually why I had to take off my my screen there. I actually can have my cake and eat it too. Here you go. The results provide conclusive evidence that the linen of the Shroud of Turin is medieval. So this is conclusive evidence, okay? If you want to deny reality, you can deny reality. We can't stop you. But this has been conclusive, this is conclusive evidence. You have no excuse for denying reality. I have to say, back to G.K. Chesterton for a moment. You are the dogmatist. It is we Christians who accept all actual evidence. It is you rationalists who refuse actual evidence, being constrained to do so by your creed. Exactly. So with that, I guess I should go back to Barrie.
And in the end, they only took one very small sample, and in a half arguing as to where these. Unfortunately, when it got down to it, they stood over the cloth for about an hour and a half arguing as to where they should take the sample from. And in the end, they only took one very small sample along the edge of one seam at one corner of the cloth. They took that sample and they cut it in half and put half of it aside as a reserve sample. And they took the remaining half, divided it in thirds by weight, and distributed it to the 3 different laboratories, Arizona, Zurich, and Oxford. The 3 labs then went ahead and performed their radiocarbon dating testing on their respective samples, came up with slightly varying dates within a few hundred years of each other, and came out and stated that the shroud could be no older than 1260 to 1390 as the origins of that cloth. That pretty much brought everything to a screeching halt in the world of the shroud. But I have to remind you that our team had performed the tests that we'd performed, published our data in peer-reviewed scientific journals, and not these open access internet journals that we have today where the only thing they review is your check, and if it clears, they publish your work. In those days, we couldn't leak anything to the media, because if anything of our work came out in the media, then the real quality journals wouldn't publish it. So our work was published in the highest quality peer-reviewed journals of the day. And so there's plenty of evidence that supports the claims made by the STIRP team that this cloth isn't a painting, it isn't a photograph, it isn't a scorch, it's none of the things the skeptics claimed, that the image was formed by some mechanism that is yet to be determined. We were able to characterize chemistry and physics, but we could not determine a mechanism to create an image with those chemical and physical properties. So all of that evidence existed when the carbon dating came out. Now, in the real world of science, and you can check with any archaeologist that you might know, that if you are doing an archaeological dig and you find different objects and you decide to date those objects are first characterized based on the level that they're found in the ground with other artifacts that are found at that same level. And if a carbon date on one of those objects comes back and it's completely different than what all the other evidence shows, they discard the carbon date. They don't keep it. It's called an outlier, and they throw it away. They do not use it. In the case of the shroud, they did just the opposite. There was, let's just, for arbitrary numbers, say there were 100 pieces of evidence. 99 of them, those coming from our team, pointed towards authenticity. One of them, the radiocarbon date, pointed in the opposite direction, and they threw away all the 99 and kept the one. And that's not the way real science works. And as I say, I've spoken with archaeologists, a number of archaeologists on this, and they all agree that it's not the most reliable thing all the time. So it is sad that this one test, and that's all it was a single test, because they all used virtually the same piece of material, pointed in the direction that they pointed it in. Yeah, at the time that the radiocarbon dating came out, that was the only piece of evidence that was not supportive of the authenticity of the shroud, and it was amazing how everybody just immediately discarded all the other evidence in favor of that one because apparently it fit their personal requirements rather than just telling the truth about the science. Now, let's talk about the radiocarbon dating for a moment. First of all, there is strong evidence in the historic record that shows the Shroud of Turin was in existence way before the radiocarbon dating earliest possible date. The most prominent of those is something called the Prey Codex or Prey manuscript. It's a Hungarian illuminated manuscript still in the museum in Budapest to this day. That's an illustration of the shroud. It shows a herringbone weave. It shows Jesus nude with his arms crossed across his torso like we have on the shroud. And remember this, historically artists always showed Jesus with a modesty cloth, and that's true. But the man on the shroud does not have a modesty cloth, breaking the convention of almost all artworks done throughout history.
Okay, I'm just going to break in briefly. This is the Prey Codex. Barrie will be talking more about it. It is from the 12th century, I believe. Hungary, if I'm not mistaken. And that's actually the Prey Codex, period. I'll let Barrie talk about, what you're seeing, and then I will provide more slides that illustrate what Barrie is saying. But let's go back to Barrie.
Nor does the man illustrated in the Prey Codex have a modesty cloth. So there's a relationship there, but most importantly, there's some burn holes in the shroud that predate the fire that caused most of the visible damage on it, and those are sort of shaped like inverted L's. And this monk, probably, who illuminated this manuscript, had obviously seen the shroud. Those L-shaped burn holes would have been the most prominent and visible thing on the cloth at first glance before you noticed the subtle image, which is only 10 to 15% darker than the background. And he included them in his illustration, and even the orientation is correct. And I think I demonstrate this in my lectures. I actually show this.
Well, Barrie shows it, and I can show it through the magic of technology. So here you have the Prey Codex itself, and I actually did not understand it until I got these like zoomed in pictures. So let's start with the shroud itself. There's the shroud itself, and these are the burn holes that Barrie is talking about. You see them circled there. 1, 2, 3, 4. And the shroud was folded over, so these are the same burns. I mean, I believe, if I have the story correctly, I may not, that I may be confusing stories. I do that a lot. I've done it on the show, by the way. Not stories, but it was Lancet magazine. It was a Nature magazine about the hydroxychloroquine, and it's James Tour, not James Wood, was the synthetic organic chemist. Thank you very much, Charlotte, for the James Tour, and I forgot who pointed out the Lancet, but another advantage of the chat stream is it keeps me honest. But in any case, the shroud was folded, and at one point it was in a silver reliquary case, chest, so to speak. There was a fire, and some of the silver or solder or something dripped onto the shroud and made these burn holes. That may not be these burn holes, though. In any case, it may have been the larger burns that were made by the dripping silver. That's what I don't remember. But in any case, something caused these burn holes, and because it was just 4 holes on cloth, which is folded over, they appear 4 times in different intensities, so to speak. So I would imagine that the number 1 was at the top, number 2 was the next layer under it, then number 3 was the next layer under it, and then number 4 was the next layer under that, which is why the marks are most visible starting with 1 and then 2 and then 3 and then 4. And you'll see that they're L-shaped, and you'll see where they are on the cloth. So that's the burn holes on the shroud itself. And then here is the pre-codex. Now, what we're talking about is the lower image, not the top image of Jesus being laid out, but the lower image which shows the cloth. And you'll see there that there's a part of the cloth that has all those red crosses. That's at the very, very bottom. And then just above it, there is a cloth that has a kind of, black and white zigzag. So let's zoom in on that, which I've done here. I've zoomed in on it. And so there's the cloth. And we're looking at the part that has the green circle. And then you see I put a little yellow highlighter on the holes. The holes. Those are the 4 holes in an L shape. Those are the 4 holes in an L shape that are the same L shape and the same 4 holes as these. So the pre-codex must have been drawn by somebody who was familiar with the Shroud of Turin. But unfortunately, I don't want to say unfortunately, the pre-codex comes from 2 centuries before when the earliest date of the carbon-14 would allow the shroud to have been made. So I hope that's been helpful. Oops, okay, so you guys are still with me. Good, apparently my internet connection is surviving. You may be able to tell from the background if you're a regular viewer that I'm not in my normal place. So that's why. I'll make a comment about the Sudarium of Oviedo that one of you have asked about. I do want to do a show on that. I have an excellent book on that with excellent, unbelievable pictures. Actually, the book was put together by a contemplative nun who actually lives in a hermitage outside of Oviedo so that she could meditate in front of the Sudarium all the time. But that's not here. So I have to wait until I go back home, unless I get someone to send me a copy of the book. Before I don't want to do the show on the Sudarium without using that book because it's just too good. Anyway, back to the show. Actually, whenever I get confused, I can just hit play and go back to Barrie. So here we go.
And even the orientation is correct. And I think I demonstrate this in my lectures. I actually show this. So there's strong evidence that the earliest possible date the radiocarbon dating guys gave us can't be correct.
Okay, now I found another zoom in I have that makes it also clear. This is a photograph of the 4 holes from the shroud. And this is, of course, a zooming in of the 4 holes on, you can see the herringbone weave that the artist tried to, illustrate. The 4 holes on the pre-codex, okay? So one heck of a coincidence, right? But it's a couple of centuries before the carbon-14 dating would allow the shroud to have been forged. How much evidence do you need, guys? How much evidence do you need? Here, I have a red pill for you. Please take the red pill. Please wake up. Please, please, please. You know what the stakes are? The stakes are eternity. Your eternity is dependent on taking the red pill. Please, for your own sake, take the red pill. Anyway, back to Barrie, I guess.
Now, I'm not a physicist, so I didn't know why there was a problem. And it wasn't until 2000, 12 years later, that 2 researchers came out with a theory that the radiocarbon dating was perfectly correct. And the only thing that was wrong was the sample chosen for dating. And remember, they only took 1 sample, so there was not even a point of comparison on one end to the other end of the cloth. It's very hard when you have a 14.5-foot sheet of cloth, 3.5 feet wide, a lot of square footage there, to take one little sample from one little corner and say that represents this entire cloth. So this husband and wife research team, Benford and Marino, they proposed that the sample site had been taken from a rewoven portion of that corner. And they were able to provide evidence from 3 independent textile experts using photographs of the sample Zurich had been given, that there was some manipulation had been done in that corner by someone very skilled in a technique that we found out is called French invisible reweaving. And ironically, at the time this probably occurred, the shroud was in France. And remembering that the shroud was owned by the Savoy family, the monarchy of Italy, this was perfected at the French court, and it made good sense with the shroud in France that this would be a likely object for them to apply this technique on. There's scientific evidence that has now been published in 2 different peer-reviewed journals, both of them very highly regarded, that strongly supports the theory that the sample site chosen was a repaired or rewoven area, not a patch, which is a terminology I've chastised Benford and Marino for using that term because it's confusing. There were 30 patches in the shroud from the 1532 fire, and so people often think they must have cut a piece from one of those patches. No, this was a rewoven corner.
Okay, because I'm reading the chats and I see this business from Katie. Thank you for watching all my live streams, Katie. But and I thought what your thought until Barrie came along. I thought what you thought, which was that it was a sample. They had taken the sample from a patch, but it's more complicated than that. They didn't. They take a sample from invisible reweaving. I don't know if any of you guys know about invisible reweaving. I had a suit once. I'm an old guy, so in those days, people still did invisible reweaving. And I got a hole in it, and I took it to an invisible reweaver, and I never thought it would work. It was a Glen plaid suit, and it was absolutely perfectly done. It was absolutely invisible, the hole. You couldn't tell where it had been. They take thread by thread. They weave like new fabric in the hole. Is what they do. They actually make new fabric from individual threads to fill the hole. That's invisible reweaving. It can be 100% invisible. So it's not a patch. A patch would have probably been spotted right away as being irrelevant. But this, to the naked eye, you could not tell it wasn't part of the original fabric. I'll let Barrie go on.
And there's some strong scientific evidence supporting the fact that that corner was anomalous, had been repaired, and did not represent the main body of the shroud cloth. It was anomalous. But there are some other things that happen that make the question mark even bigger. How about this? That 3 laboratories were ultimately chosen to do the radiocarbon dating.
I'm going to stop Barrie there. I'll go back because he's going on another topic, which is really great, which has to do with fraud. I alluded to that the guy in charge of this was given £1 million British pounds as soon as he came up with the right answer. So let me stay with the invisible reweaving business because it's really important because it completely explains the carbon dating to the exact period when the carbon dating dated the cloth to. First of all, this is a book, you see that, Invisible French Reweaving Simplified, because some skeptics said it doesn't exist. There's no such thing as invisible French reweaving. But here's a, book that they found that actually, tells you how to do it. This is from anyway, you'll see. All of the major European courts had teams of skilled weavers and embroiderers who were employed in the repair of high-quality textiles. Identifying 16th century repairs is not easy. 18th and 19th century repairs are much easier. In other words, it's extremely difficult, it's extremely sophisticated, very, very highly skilled, and a kind of a lost art, not completely lost or you wouldn't have that book, but practically lost. And so thank you for the Katie, I see that you corrected it to mean weaving, but I don't think sisters could have done this. This would have been, a real full-time, like a PhD kind of one profession, like a violin maker, like Stradivarius or something, somebody who spent their life just learning this skill and practicing this skill. Maybe there were some nuns who did that, but I would be really surprised. I think this was. Don't forget that the shroud was owned by royalty, right? It was the kings. What was it? King of? Oh gosh, I should know this stuff off the top of my head. Of Savoy. It was the royal house of Savoy that owned the shroud. This is like billionaires, right? So, and they have tapestries. This art of invisible French reweaving was developed for tapestries. Those incredibly expensive, elaborate tapestries they had in the Middle Ages that would be seen from both sides. So would have to be invisible from the back also. So, and of course, who had those tapestries, which must have cost hundreds of thousands of dollars of the money of the day, were the same super rich royalty that, had the shroud. So that's, I'm sure, that, as this quote says, all of the major European courts, because it would have to be multimillionaires, had teams of skilled weavers and embroiderers who were employed in the repair of high quality textiles. So that's where this would have been done. And here you see some evidence of the invisible reweaving. If you see the text there, it says weave pattern inconsistencies noted in blinded review of the Zurich C14 sample, blah, 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 blah. So this is one of the samples taken. And that picture, it's kind of, I guess, not all that easy to see what's going on. So I zoomed in on it. And here, if you look at I don't even know really how to understand this. I think that what you see is on the right hand side, some of the vertical threads are much thinner than the vertical threads on the left hand side of the picture. In other words, the other half of the herringbone. The other half of the herringbone has thinner and thicker threads alternating, but the thinner threads alternating are much thinner on the right-hand side of the picture, which is the rewoven, the invisible rewoven side. And now I'll let Barrie explain how. I'll actually put this up while he explains it. Maybe I'll put this up while he explains it, and then you'll understand what you're seeing when you listen to Barrie explain it. Let me back up a few seconds.
In the shroud from the 1532 fire, had aired or rewoven arrows that viewed journals, both of them very highly regarded, the object for them to apply this technique on. There's scientific evidence that the shroud is owned by the Savoy, that there was some manipulation had been free from fire. A lot of square footage there to take one little sample for the practice. And I think I demonstrate this in my lectures. I actually show this. So there's strong evidence that the earliest possible date the radiocarbon dating guys gave us can't be correct. Now, I'm not a physicist, so I didn't know why there was a problem. And it wasn't until 2000, 12 years later, that two researchers came out with a theory that the radiocarbon dating was perfectly correct. And the only thing that was wrong was the sample chosen for dating. And remember, they only took one sample, so there was not even a point of comparison on one end to the other end of the cloth. It's very hard when you have a 14.5-foot sheet of cloth, 3.5 feet wide, a lot of square footage there, to take one little sample from one little corner and say that represents this entire cloth. So this husband and wife research team, Benford and Marino, they proposed that the sample site had been taken from a rewoven portion of that corner. And they were able to provide evidence from 3 independent textile experts using photographs of the sample Zurich had been given, that there was some manipulation had been done in that corner by someone very skilled in a technique that we found out is called French invisible reweaving. And ironically, at the time this probably occurred, the shroud was in France. And remembering that the shroud was owned by the Savoy family, the monarchy of Italy, this was perfected at the French court, and it made good sense with the shroud in France that this would be a likely object for them to apply this technique on. There's scientific evidence that has now been published in 2 different peer-reviewed journals, both of them very highly regarded, that strongly supports the theory that the sample site chosen was a repaired or rewoven area, not a patch, which is a terminology I've chastised Benford and Marino for using that term because it's confusing. There were 30 patches in the shroud from the 1532 fire, and so people often think they must have cut a piece from one of those patches. No, this was a rewoven corner, and there's some strong scientific evidence supporting the fact that that corner was anomalous, had been repaired, and did not represent the main body of the shroud cloth. It was anomalous. But there are some other things that happened that make the question mark even bigger. How about this? That 3 laboratories were ultimately chosen to do the radiocarbon dating. The 3 labs were supervised by one man from the British Museum. Okay, so he was sort of in charge of the entire operation and supervised the 3 laboratories in doing their tests. As soon as the paper came out debunking, and I'm putting that in quotes, the shroud, Oxford, one of the 3 laboratories that did the testing, received £1 million anonymous as a contribution for debunking the shroud. And the gentleman from the British Museum left the British Museum, and part of that £1 million contribution funded a permanent chair for him at Oxford. Now, when people say to me, well, gee, does that mean there was a conspiracy? I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that it doesn't really smell very good. And it's kind of ironic that these guys benefited personally from an anonymous contribution. And I'm not accusing anybody of anything, but I am asking this question. When did they know they were going to get that £1 million? Did they have any inkling in advance that that might come? And if so, what influence might that have had on their results? You have to ask these questions because these are human beings and they're susceptible to, to the weaknesses that we all have. So, again, I'm not accusing anybody of anything. I'm just saying that there are so many suspicious things that were, just for an example, they argued for an hour and a half over the shroud before they took the samples. Then they cut that little piece from that one corner. Then they left the room for 30 minutes and came back with sealed stainless steel containers, which means you couldn't see what was in them, instead of glass, which is typical in laboratories. And, why did they leave the room for 30 minutes and then came back with sealed metal containers where you couldn't see what was in them? So what happened in that room? I don't know. I'm not saying anything happened in the room, but the fact that they left the room away from the camera and came back 30 minutes later with sealed non-glass containers.
Right. Talk about chain of custody.
Yeah, that's bad science. That's just bad science. Also, each sample taken for carbon dating was supposed to be chemically analyzed by the laboratories before they burnt the samples, because that's what you do. You burn the samples, catch the gases, and that's what you test for, with your counter there. And yet they didn't do the chemical analysis of the samples, which was in their own protocol. And when they were asked why, they said, well, because we already knew which sample was the one from the shroud. So much for the blind study they were doing. How did they know which sample was from the shroud? Because there was only one herringbone woven sample in the bunch they were each given. All the others were square weave. And so it was really easy to identify, and this was supposed to be a blind study. They weren't supposed to know which one was from the shroud. So right off the bat, there's 2 parts of their protocol shot away right there. So,
I didn't know that. You don't mention that, do you, in your talks? I didn't hear that.
I don't go into this detail in my talks because I don't want to be accused of making accusations about people. Sure. And like I said,
obviously, I don't mind being accused of making accusations, but really, the museum official who's in charge of this testing, that's supposed to be blind. The people are not supposed to know which sample came from the Shroud of Turin. Of course, they do know which sample came from the Shroud of Turin because the only herringbone weave that they've been given. So the blind, to keep them from not, to keep them unable to know which was the Shroud of Turin and which were the placebo samples, so to speak, right? They make one herringbone and the other 2 square weave. Now, why did they do that? Could it have anything to do? Who gave them £1 million anonymously? And you think that museum director preferred being a museum director or preferred having a chair at Oxford University for his well-funded chair at Oxford University for the rest of his life? And when did he know that he would get that chair and get that £1,000,000? Or, you know what I mean, the £1,000,000, whereas effectively, he was the beneficiary of. Did he know that before he structured the test to be able to fraudulently come up with a date for the shroud? Anyway, Barrie is too prudent, and of course this is his mainstream. It's not his job to he doesn't want to make himself vulnerable by accusing somebody of fraud without being able to prove it. So he just says these are interesting questions. I agree, they're very interesting questions. As a matter of fact, I'll stop babbling and let him actually talk.
Shot away right there.
Oh,
So
I didn't know that. You don't mention that, do you, in your talks? I didn't hear that.
I don't go into this detail in my talks because I don't want to be accused of making accusations about people.
Sure.
And like I said, I pose it simply as a question. Did they know they were going to get that money? And if so, when did they know? And if they knew in advance, what does that do to disqualify them and all their testing right from the beginning?
Now, I saw some photographs. I'm, of course, just a kind of reasonably intelligent layman, but I saw some photographs that I guess were taken in the 78 investigation, which implied that the corner from which the sample was taken was chemically different from the rest of the shroud?
Yes. Those are called the quad mosaics. They were done by Jean Lohr at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena. He was the other team member of STIRP from JPL, along with Don Lynn. John Lohr, who didn't know about the Benford-Marino theories or the work that Ray Rogers was doing to follow up on that, he didn't know about any of that. And so I wrote him and I said, would you explain to me what these mean? Because, he was a hardcore scientist. I wanted to get it in his own words. And he had no knowledge that Benford-Marino had claimed, there was an anomaly in the sample that was chosen. So what he wrote back to me was, he says, basically those are chemical maps. And what they do is show different chemical compositions on the cloth. It doesn't tell us what the chemistry is. It just shows a differential because they color code different densities to different chemistries.
Let me just back up because I've seen the photographs. So what they look like is actually they look like thermal imaging to me, but they're color photographs of almost, I don't want to say random colors, but oranges and reds and greens and so forth.
Correct.
And the color in a particular spot on the shroud reflects something about the chemical composition. One doesn't really know what, but one knows that if the chemical composition is the same, it's going to be the same color. So if it's a very different color, it's a different chemistry of the cloth.
Exactly correct.
Okay, so that's what this picture is up here for. That is exactly the thermal imaging picture, the quad mosaic picture that Barrie is talking about. And I found, actually in a scientific paper, the description of how it was done. 3 separate black and white film frames are exposed for each area of the shroud. I'm a nerd, you might want to skip this section. Each exposure is made onto a separate frame of film using a different color separation filter. These 3 separate black and white images are then recombined to create a full color image. And these color images should be interpreted as chemical composition maps. We don't know what the chemicals are, only that they're not the same everywhere. Basically, the fabric is photographed with under ultraviolet light. I'm not 100% sure. With color filters, in front of the camera. Red, green, blue, whatever the primary colors are. I'm not much of a photographer. And the different chemicals react differently to the ultraviolet light. And so I can't do better than that explanation. But anyway, so the black and white pictures will show, there'll be different intensities of the image, the black and white image, depending on what the reaction of that chemical was to the ultraviolet light. I'm not doing any good, so I'm not going to continue explaining it. I'm sorry, I don't understand it well enough to do a good job explaining it. But basically, in any case, Barrie kind of explained it. So what this picture tells you, you don't know what the chemical is, but you know that if it's all the same chemical, it's going to be all the same color, because different chemicals fluoresce whatever differently under the ultraviolet light. Not a great explanation. It's a fake explanation. But anyway, you get the idea. So that is what you see there. What you see there, you see the patch in the corner, in the obviously lower left-hand corner. And that's one chemical, one whatever you call it, one chemical composition. I believe it's cotton, actually. That green represents cotton. And so you can see the outline of the patch very neatly. You actually can see even the corner, the edge of the patch. And then you see the area from which the sample was taken is kind of mixed red to green. Now, what's going to turn out is that it's cotton threads that are appearing green under this whatever ultraviolet light technique. And the linen threads are appearing, reddish, yellowish. And so you can see that you can see that the green is more intense near the edge of the patch and less intense out of it. And I don't know exactly the history of it. It's a good question. Was it that the corner was damaged and they started with French invisible reweaving and then kind of gave up and decided to sew a patch on the very corner? I don't know what the story is. But clearly, the area from which the sample was taken has those mixed threads. Now, you should believe it just obviously from that picture. But in fact, I can find it here. Someone else took the threads, and under a very high microscope, could actually, those are cotton threads. The white threads are cotton threads, and the other threads are linen threads. So there are many cotton fibers in the radiocarbon area. What they did was they got a part of the sample that was taken for the carbon-14 dating that wasn't destroyed by the carbon-14 dating, and they were able to examine it, and they actually could see the carbon threads. Now, the linen shroud is a linen shroud. It doesn't have mixed carbon threads in it. So the carbon threads are evidence of the invisible reweaving. Now, why was carbon used for the invisible reweaving instead of linen for the invisible reweaving? That's very simple to answer. It's that you can't dye linen easily at all. And they wanted to match the color on the shroud. So they dyed cotton and wove it in instead. And in fact, you can see on the thread, on one of the threads, one of the cotton threads, you can see the dye here. And you can see the coloration on the vertical thread. So they dyed cotton to match the color of the linen, because it's very difficult to dye linen. And then they rewove it. So back to Barrie.
Correct, Roy. And that's what you see. Now, what's interesting...
But one knows that if the chemical composition is the same, it's going to be the same color. So if it's a very different color, it's a different chemistry of the cloth.
Exactly correct, Roy. And that's what you see. Now, what's interesting is this. There's a seam, and to the left of the seam is an area that was cut out probably by the Savoy family to create relics and give them as gifts to other royal families. And so there was a patch sewn in there. Now, that patch is of a different material, and so it was a completely different color than the warmer tone colors, reds and oranges and yellows, that the shroud showed up in. Except that when you cross that seam, that's where the radiocarbon dating sample was taken from, and it's green that gradually goes out to the warmer tones of the shroud. It's a thin band of that, and it's not an evenly shaped band, indicating there's a different chemical composition along that strip that was cut out for dating. And so that is one of the pieces of scientific evidence that indicates a different chemical composition in that sample site. And although skeptics like to poo-poo that because they don't understand what John Lohr did, so I had him write it down, and we published that on Shroud.com so you can read it. And he knew nothing about any of this. He'd been out of the mix for many years by then. He just explained what he did in those images and what their significance was. Well, they show that the sample site taken and used for radiocarbon dating the shroud was of a different chemical composition, to some extent, than the rest of that cloth. And that's one strong piece of corroborating evidence right there. They actually go thread by thread and replace them. Ironically, here's the thing, and this is something one of the skeptics has pointed out. Well, look, they reweave things all the time, but we would see on the back side of the cloth the bad, sort of the loose threads and stuff that you wouldn't see from the front. Because typically when you have something rewoven today, it's perfect on the side that everybody sees, but on the inside, if you turn it inside out, well, there's little threads and things. It's not perfect. Well, French invisible reweaving was actually invented or created to deal with two-sided tapestries that had to be viewed on both sides, and it had to be perfect on both sides. And that's why it was so expensive, and it's become a lost art. And when this first came out, one of the folks in Turin, who's a supposed textile expert, said no such kind of reweaving even exists. And then just a few months after she made that statement, we found a book called French Invisible Reweaving, a Lost Art, or something like that. And so why would somebody apply that to the shroud? Well, it was perfected in France by the French court. The shroud was in France at that moment in its history. What more logical object to do that on than something as important to them as the shroud?
And because the threads are then mixed between old threads and new threads, you could have a gradual transition in the chemical composition.
You certainly would. And remember that we don't know the depth or the length of the reweave. We don't have any, nobody checked in advance to look for that. And it certainly wasn't expected by anybody. So I think that that it's fair to say that nobody expected them to look for something like that. If you test one thing and you get that one result, that doesn't prove that the whole cloth is that age. It proves that that corner was that age. And if there was, in fact, interweaving of newer material into the older linen materials that, the original shroud was, you're going to find that the date is going to be skewed dramatically. So, and that's the other thing. We know that this cloth was a pure linen cloth because we looked at it all over with microscopes, with magnifying glasses, and with different types of imaging testing. And, in looking at the shroud, and what we found there was that we don't know whether there's other anomalies on that cloth. It could well be that other areas might have been manipulated. But in the end, testing only one piece in that one corner is not a reliable test that allows you to make a claim of a 95% certainty, which is what the three laboratories claim for their testing. And here's what was maybe most important. Found interwoven into that corner were cotton threads and a dye that had been applied to match the color to the remainder of the cloth. Why did they interweave cotton? Well, cotton can take dye a lot easier than linen, which requires a special treatment for dyes to sort of soak into the linen. It's got a waxy outer surface. But finding cotton interwoven there, we didn't find that anywhere else on the shroud. And there's an indication that the people who did the mending knew exactly how to do it. Then they applied this dye in a gum arabic base. We even know the dye is from the madder root plant, rose madder dye, chemically analyzed. That was found in that corner. Somebody had carefully tried to dye it to match the rest of the color of the shroud and hide their repair. And that's been chemically analyzed, and we know that's there. So, but it also breaks all the rules of Judaism because you can't have cotton interwoven with this, and that would make it treif. It would no longer be the appropriate burial shroud for somebody of high stature.
Yeah, you couldn't even wear it. I mean,
that's right.
You can't even wear clothing that mixes linen with cotton.
And people again forget the cultural context of the first century. Cannot apply 21st century context to what happened 2,000 plus years ago. Here's my mission, because I didn't know what my mission was. Remember, I questioned why I was on that team right from the first minute. But in the end, I came to realize that I was given a great privilege to be in that room with this piece of cloth There were 1 billion people on this planet who had more right to be there than I did, yet for some reason God saw fit to put me there. But it was not about making photographs in 1978. It was about bringing this to a much broader audience 20 years later when the internet became available. And that's where I found out what my purpose was. It wasn't just to be the documenting photographer, but years later to be a spokesman for the science that, in my opinion, clearly indicates this is the real thing. And so my ministry is simply about the truth, just about being honest. One of the things that prompted me to build the website was the fact that my friends were calling me up, and one of them called me and said, "Oh, you know that shroud thing you're involved with? Well, that's just a photo by Leonardo da Vinci." And I kind of laughed. I thought he was putting me on, but it turns out a book had come out in '95 that made that claim. I hadn't heard about it, and I asked him, "Where did you get your information?" And he said, "Well, my wife and I were checking out at the grocery store. It was on one of the tabloids." And I had, and I had this epiphany at that moment. I realized I was on the inside. I was an insider. I had access to all this data. I had been a participant. I held that cloth in my own hand, left my own DNA all over it as well. And I realized that the public didn't have access to that, and they weren't getting the truth. So I wrote, at that moment, while I was still on the phone with the guy, there was a manila folder on my desk, and I wrote, "Consider building a website." And that's when I believe God reached down at that moment of that conversation, said, "Now here's the real plan. This is why you're here. You are going to build that website, and you're going to put this information out there so that anybody who wants it can have access to it. And that way, instead of you trying to pitch the science, you make the science available and let them decide for themselves." And I wrote those very words on the front page of the website over 18 years ago. Given the facts, we believe you have to make up your own mind about this. I first had to come to terms with the science before I could even get to the faith aspect of it. Mm-hmm. And it took a long time just for the science to finally convince me, but it did. I always quote Arthur Conan Doyle out of the lips of Sherlock Holmes: "If you eliminate all the possibilities, whatever remains, no matter how improbable, is most likely the truth." And based on that axiom, I came to accept the shroud had to be the real thing. Look, my little almost 91-year-old mother 9 years ago heard me give a lecture in person for the first time. She was very quiet as we drove home, and I asked her, "Well, what do you think?" And she turned to me and she said, "Well, of course, it's authentic." And I was shocked. This is a 90-year-old woman born in Poland, not well educated. And I said, "Well, what makes you say that?" And she said, "They wouldn't have kept it for 2,000 years belonging to anybody else. It wouldn't have mattered."
They wouldn't have spent all that money on the invisible reweaving.
Exactly. Yeah, she didn't say that, but exactly the point. And I kind of laughed, and then I realized what a profound observation that is. That really is very profound in the sense that, you know, why was this burial shroud kept in secret, hidden away, violation of Jewish law? They couldn't come running out of the tomb and say, "Look what we found." There were iconoclasts that would have destroyed it, and perhaps them too.
I interrupted Barrie to answer a chat, actually, about cotton and why this was forbidden. And it's not that cotton is forbidden. It's that you're not allowed to mix two different two different kinds of thread into one fabric. So the example in the Old Testament is you're not allowed to mix linen and wool, I believe, but that's understood within Judaism to just mean that you're not allowed to mix fibers from different sources, from different kinds of fabric into one weave. So that's what makes it non-kosher. Not that it's cotton, but that it's mixed. And as to why God gave the Jews that law, I have no idea. And I don't like to put words into God's mouth, because I may be called to account. I look forward to seeing him. And he might have a much better reason than the one that I guess at. So I leave that to him. Some of his laws, you can pretty much figure out why, like why you shouldn't kill and why you shouldn't commit adultery. But others of the laws that he gave the Jews in the Old Testament, like why you can eat one kind of fish and not another kind of fish, or why you can eat, dead cows, but you can't eat dead horses. I leave that to him. But he just gave the laws, and Judaism just accepts them because he gave them, not because they know why. People are just guessing, and I don't want to, as I said, be in the business of guessing why God did something. So with that, let me go back to Barrie, who makes more consistently sense, and also who hasn't spoken into a muted microphone so far. Oh, and somebody also asked whether the interview is live. And it was live when I did the interview, but that was a while ago. And it was sound only. It was before, this business with images. So I'm using that older interview with Barrie as the framework, and I'm adding the slides and everything. So back to Barrie.
And so this is something that had to be kept secret. The first image of Jesus portrayed looking like the man of the shroud was 285 AD in the Comitia catacomb.
Wow.
And that image looks very much like the man of the shroud.
Okay, so too bad, Barrie, you didn't get to talk much. But here is the image from the 3rd century, from the catacomb of did I write down the name of the catacomb? Barrie just said it. Here it is. It's of Comodilla, catacomb of Comodilla. And as Barrie points out, the image of Jesus in this picture from the 3rd century certainly looks suspiciously like the artist saw the shroud. Anyway, back to Barrie.
If you go a few hundred years later, you'll look at the iconography started by both the Catholic and primarily the Orthodox Church. You'll see that he looks just like the man of the shroud. And a lot of people say, well, yeah, everybody used the last artist rendition as their, for their rendition. But how did it get started? And where we have a bearded man that looks like the man of the shroud. And if you look at the iconography, there are many icons that are very much like the man of the shroud.
Well,
so anyway, here I've collected some. Actually, I didn't have to collect them. The Shroud of Turin exhibit at Notre Dame Center collected them, of pictures of, you can see the centuries. 4th century is, they date the Comodilla to 4th century. I don't know why. I guess there's some disagreement about that. 6th century, 11th century, 12th century, 13th century. I will add as a little teaser for when I ever do get to do a show on the Sudarium of Oviedo that they also are identical with the image on the Sudarium. And if you overlay the image of the Sudarium, and they do that in this book, if you take a transparency of the face of Jesus in the Sudarium and overlay it on an image of the face of Jesus on the shroud, they are absolutely perfect match. So whether the artist took the face of Jesus from the Sudarium or from the shroud seems to me a little bit impossible to determine, since the images are the same. But there are a half a dozen or so, 7 images from the top of that exhibit page, and here are another 5 images from the bottom, and you can see the incredible similarity. As a matter of fact, I'm going out on a limb here, but many of the pictures have what look like a lock of hair in the middle of the forehead. You see that one on the bottom, that 13th century icon from Rostov. And let me go back to the top and see if any of those have that same funny little lock of hair on the top. It's a little harder to tell the truth. But I wonder whether that lock of hair is actually the blood drip that's shown on the shroud. The darkness from the blood drip. I guess the one to the right of the Rostov one also has that kind of lock of hair on the forehead. And the one on the top of the right looks like it has it too. But anyway, so let me go back to Barrie.
Some of them even show defects in the shroud, right? Like fold lines, which are really there.
Yeah, there was one or two of them where there's this deep crease under the chin, and the artist incorporated that. Now, they didn't know what it was, so they either tried to make it part of the collar that he was wearing or something like that, but they included it, indicating they'd seen this piece of cloth.
Anyway, do you have anything you want to say before we come to the end of the show?
Well, I would just like to say what a great pleasure it was to finally meet you, Roy, and I'm going to let the audience know that when I first heard from Roy, it was several days before I was coming down to Florida there, and as soon as I saw his name, I knew who he was because 4 of my Catholic friends over the last probably 4 or 5 years have sent me copies of Roy's book, Salvation is from the Jews. Hint, hint, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, from my Catholic friends. But I thought it was a wonderful opportunity to finally get to meet this man whose name I had known for so long. And so I just want to thank you for coming over to the university and spending 3 or 4 hours sitting there with me, just talking about our personal experiences and what got us to where we are today.
Great. Well, I want to thank you very much. This has been a beautiful experience, and also, of course, want to thank you for meeting you. I want to thank our listeners for having listened today, and that brings us to the end of this show. I certainly hope you've enjoyed the presentation, so to speak, and all of the details and information and insight from our guest, Barrie Schwortz. If you want more, if you want to see some of those incredible photographs and look into some of the facts and subtleties that came up on the show, you can go to his website, www.shroud.com.
And yes, I have the mic on this time. So that's the
Are you
end.
there, Barrie?
I'm here. Good to be with you. Roy.
Thanks.
Sorry
Always,
about that. Let
always
me,
nice to talk
let
to
me
you.
shut that off. That's the
and
start
so
of the recording again. This is the homepage of his website, which is shroud.com. And I can't believe it. Thank you so much, Katie. Here I've been going, almost 3 hours, and you're sorry that I'm ending the show. So am I, of course. But in any case, thank you. Thank you for bearing with me and sticking with it. I will break this up into 2 eventually when I figure out how to do it on YouTube, because I don't think anyone in their right mind would start watching a 3-hour video. But anyway, so that's it. This is his website, the homepage. It's like, drudge.com used to be, or Drudge Report or whatever. It's basically links to tons and tons of wonderful articles and pictures and stuff. And there are lots of other, did I make a note? I didn't make a note of, boy, I forgot all the other good, maybe I'll pull it up. I'll try to pull it up now, actually, and see what happens. So let me try to do this without destroying anything. But I want to, there are lots and lots and lots of wonderful Shroud websites, and I want to see if I can get their names without garbling them. And I'm not sure I can fast enough. Probably not. I'm going to give it one more shot here, and I am wasting your time, I'm afraid. I'll put them underneath the in the description. When I find them, Shroud I'm guessing shroudproject.com, shroudphotos.com, and so forth. It's also worthwhile, by the way, to it's really fun if you're as perverse in these things as I am, to like Google, especially after watching this show and seeing this overwhelming mountain of evidence for the Shroud, to look at the skeptics' debunking of the Shroud. If you just like Google, Shroud fraud or something, or Shroud fake, it's comical. Anyway. So anyway, thank you for watching. I babble too much. Otherwise, this wouldn't have been 3 hours. And I see from the chat, some of you like the fact that it's on the weekend, so you can watch live. So I'll try to do that. I don't have full control over that. It has to do with my mass schedule and my other schedule and so forth. Thank you for watching. And I guess, like always, I should go back to the Harpa Dei music. That music, I think I did mention it, of course, on the thing, but it's the Lamentations of Jesus, because it's the Shroud, but it's in Corsican, and I suspect that none of us understand Corsican, but it's still very beautiful. So with that, I will say goodbye until next time. I don't know when that'll be. It'll probably be less than a week, I hope. I don't know what it'll be either. It may not actually be a continuation of the science and faith business, because if you watch these 7 shows, And you're still not convinced? I'm not sure there's any point to going any further. Nothing will convince you. And also, I'm actually thinking of switching to something more spiritual in a different way. So maybe something on saints, and maybe something on different spiritualities, different monastic spiritualities or something. So anyway, or you can always send me your suggestions. I always cheat and say bye for now and keep babbling. So I'll try not to cheat. Bye for now.
La vida, odie riposi tranquillo. Ato sufrenza.